The village of Thornhaven had a dragon problem. That was not in itself unusual. Dragons were a fact of life in the northern reaches of the Valak kingdoms, much like avalanches were a fact of life in the Spine Mountains or flooding was a fact of life along the Silverwash. You learn to live with them or you learn to die by them, and either way the kingdom did not much care which you chose. The garrison at Eastwatch was 3 days' ride south, and the lord who nominally governed this stretch of territory had not set foot north of the River Care in 11 years. The villagers of Thornhaven were on their own, as they had been for as long as anyone could remember. But their dragon problem was not the usual kind. It did not eat livestock, not regularly anyway, and never more than one sheep every few weeks, which the village could absorb the way it absorbed any other natural loss. It did not burn fields or topple grain silos. It did not snatch maidens from their homes or demand tribute of gold and gemstones, though the latter would have been particularly ironic given that Thornhaven was perhaps the poorest settlement in the entire Northern Territory, its people scraping by on subsistence farming and the occasional trade caravan that wandered through on its way to somewhere that actually mattered. No, the dragon stole toys. It had started in the spring, 4 months past, on a night so still and cold that the frost came early and the windows of every cottage had turned to sheets of white lace. Old Marin Torvesen had woken to find her grandson's carved wooden horse missing from the windowsill, where she always placed it so the boy could see it first thing in the morning. She had searched the cottage from root cellar to rafters, certain the child had hidden it as children will, but little Peter had been sleeping so deeply that he had not stirred even when she lifted his blanket to check beneath him. The horse was simply gone. Marin had thought nothing of it. Toys went missing. That was what toys did, especially in a household with a 4-year-old boy who carried his possessions to every corner of the property and abandoned them in mud puddles, haystacks, and once, memorably, inside the open mouth of the well bucket. But then it happened again and again and again. Within a fortnight, half the households in Thornhaven had reported missing toys. Wooden swords, rag dolls stuffed with wool and stitched with button eyes, a hoop and stick that belonged to the Brennan twins, a set of clay marbles that had been in the Alderman family for 3 generations, each one painted with a tiny flower in faded blue pigment, a pull toy lamb on wobbly wheels that young Sarah Kell had received on her nomming day and cherished with a ferocity that bordered on religious devotion. The lamb was what changed the conversation from puzzled annoyance to genuine fear. Sarah had cried for 3 days straight when she found it gone. Not the theatrical wailing of a child performing grief for an audience, but a deep, shaking, breathless weeping that came from somewhere far older than her 6 years. Her mother, Dice Kell, had held her through it, murmuring useless comforts, and then had marched to the alderman's house and demanded that something be done. Alderman Hollis Draven was not a brave man. He was not a particularly clever man either, but he was a careful one. And careful men in positions of small authority often developed a talent for appearing decisive without actually committing to anything that could later be held against them. He had formed a search party, 24 men with torches and pitchforks and one elderly hunting bow that may or may not have still been serviceable. And they had swept the village and the surrounding fields and the edges of the Thornwood in a great show of purposeful activity. They found nothing. It was Tomric Brennan, the younger of the twins by 7 minutes and the one who had lost the hoop and stick, who had first suggested the dragon. He was 13 and therefore considered himself nearly a man, and he had been watching the sky from the roof of his family's barn because he had been tasked with repairing a leak, and was avoiding the work with the creative dedication that only a 13-year-old boy could muster. I saw it, he said, breathless and wide-eyed, when he scrambled down from the barn and burst into the alderman's kitchen where the search party was regrouping over warm cider. Flying low right over the east field, big dark, I could see something hanging from its claws, glinting in the moonlight. What kind of something? Draven asked, and Tomric had shrugged with the magnificent indifference of youth. Couldn't tell, but it was heading toward the old quarry. The old quarry was a collapsed limestone pit 2 miles northeast of the village, half filled with rainwater and overgrown with bramble and birch. It had not been worked in living memory. It was, by general agreement, a miserable and uninviting place, and no one from Thornhaven had any reason to go there. Until now. Draven did not want to go. Every line of his body communicated this reluctance with the clarity of a written proclamation. But Sarah Kell was still crying, and Dice Kell was standing in the corner of his kitchen with arms crossed and eyes that promised political consequences if he continued to sit on his hands, and the memory of the wooden horse and the clay marbles and the rag dolls was accumulating in the room like a weight pressing down on the rafters. They went the next morning. 8 men this time, not 24. The enthusiasm had cooled overnight, as enthusiasm does, and they picked their way through the bramble and the birch saplings and the loose shale that slid beneath their boots with malicious patience. The quarry opened before them like a wound in the earth. And there at the bottom, scattered across the flat stone shelf that bordered the dark water, was every missing toy. The wooden horse, the rag dolls, the clay marbles arranged in a careful circle, the hoop and stick, the wooden swords laid side by side like an arsenal, and Sarah Kell's pull toy lamb placed at the center of the collection with a deliberateness that made Dice Kell's breath catch in her throat. But there was no dragons. They collected the toys in silence. No one spoke about what it meant that the toys had been gathered rather than destroyed, arranged rather than scattered. No one spoke about the faint grooves in the stone beneath the marbles, as though something had traced the circle again and again. No one spoke about the way the lamb had been placed at the center, upright, its chipped paint catching the pale morning light, positioned the way a mother might position a child's most precious belonging on a pillow. They took the toys back to the village and said nothing about the arrangement. They said only that the toys had been found at the bottom of the quarry, presumably lost to some animal or vagrant, and that the mystery was solved. It was not solved. The toys disappeared again 3 nights later, all of them, and new ones besides. For 4 months, this was the rhythm of Thornhaven's life. The dragon came in the dark, always between midnight and dawn, always silent except for the faint whisper of membrane against air. It took toys and only toys, never tools, never food, never clothing or coin or anything that could be construed as useful. It left no tracks except the faint scratches of claw tips on the slate roofs it landed upon, and it never, not once, harmed a single person. The villagers adapted as people do. They began keeping their children's toys locked in chests or hidden in cupboards. They posted watches, though these inevitably failed because a man standing in the cold for 6 hours will eventually close his eyes, and the dragon seemed to know exactly when that moment would come. They tried leaving out substitute objects, carved sticks, bundles of rags, shapeless lumps of clay, but the dragon ignored these with what felt improbably like disdain. It wanted the real thing. It wanted the objects that small hands had held and small hearts had loved. And it never played with them. That was the part that haunted Alderman Draven, though he would never have admitted it. He had taken to walking the perimeter of the village at dusk, not out of duty, but out of a restless, chewing curiosity that he could neither satisfy nor escape. He thought about the toys at the bottom of the quarry, arranged with such care. He thought about the way the dragon had returned for them after they were retrieved, as though it could not bear to be without them. He thought about the grooves in the stone beneath the marbles, those patient, repeated circles, and what kind of creature makes a gesture like that if not a creature that is trying to remember something, or preserve something, or hold on to something that is slipping away. He did not say any of this aloud. He was the alderman. His job was to be practical, to assign guard rotations and draft letters to the garrison that would never be answered and assure the villagers that the situation was under control when it transparently was not. He was not paid to think about the emotional interior of a dragon. But he thought about it anyway. The person who finally broke the stalemate was not a warrior or a hunter or a person of any particular distinction. She was a healer named Else Barrowman, and she was 53 years old and had hands that shook slightly in the cold, a condition that the villagers attributed to age and that Else privately attributed to the particular kind of grief that never fully resolves, but merely finds a place to settle in the body and vibrate endlessly, like a tuning fork pressed against bone. Else had come to Thornhaven 18 years ago, widowed and childless and carrying nothing but a satchel of herbs and a midwife's training, and a reputation for being very good with the dying, which was a less marketable skill than one might think. She had integrated herself into the village the way water integrates into stone slowly, through persistence rather than force, filling the small cracks and crevices of daily life until she became as much a part of the landscape as the thornwood or the quarry. She had not lost a toy to the dragon. She had no children and therefore no children's toys to lose. But she had watched the village's anxiety curdle into something harder and more dangerous over the passing weeks, and she had watched Sarah Kell stop crying and go quiet in a way that concerned her far more than the crying had, and she had begun to feel the particular pull that she always felt when suffering presented itself in a form that no one else could quite name. Else Barrowman had spent her entire adult life in the presence of suffering that could not be named. She had held the hands of women dying in childbirth and men dying in silence and children dying of fevers that had no name and no cure. And she had learned that the worst kind of pain was not the kind that announced itself with screaming, but the kind that went quiet and still and retreated to some deep, inaccessible chamber of the body where it could work undisturbed. The dragon, she thought, reminded her of that kind of pain. She announced her intention to visit the quarry alone, and the village reacted with the precise mixture of alarm and bewilderment that she had expected. "You'll be eaten," Draven said flatly. "I don't think I will," Else replied. You think you won't be eaten by a dragon." "Oh yes. And that's supposed to reassure me." Else looked at him with eyes that were the color of creek water, not beautiful, not striking, just clear and unhurried, and said nothing, because silence was often more effective than argument, and she had learned long ago that men in positions of small authority responded poorly to being argued with but often yielded in the face of a silence they could not fill. Draven yielded. He did not want to, but he yielded because else Barrowman had delivered 3 of his children and had sat with his wife through a miscarriage that still made his chest tighten when he thought about it at night, and he owed her a debt that could not be repaid and that she had never once asked him to acknowledge. He made her take a lantern, at least. She took it, and a blanket, and a small bundle of dried herbs that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with the specific kind of courage that comes from having something familiar to hold on to. The quarry at night was not the same place as the quarry at morning. In daylight it was merely sad, a scar in the earth slowly being healed by time and vegetation, the kind of place that inspired a mild, passing melancholy and nothing more. But at night, with the moon reflecting off the still water and the walls of the pit rising black and sheer on every side, it became something else entirely. It became a throat, a mouth, a place of swallowing. Else climbed down the loose shale path with the lantern held high and her boots finding purchase with a care that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the understanding that a fall here would not be forgiven. The cold pressed against her like a living thing, finding every gap in her clothing, every inch of exposed skin, and she let it press because resisting the cold was a waste of energy, and she was going to need whatever energy she had. She reached the bottom and saw the toys. They were spread across the stone shelf in a wider pattern now, the accumulation of 4 months of theft. There were dozens of them, wooden figures and cloth dolls and carved animals and balls of string, and one magnificent painted soldier on a wooden horse that must have come from a wealthier household somewhere beyond Thornhaven's borders, because nothing in this village was made with that kind of skill. The toys formed a rough ring around the water's edge, and at the center, exactly where Sarah Kell's pull toy lamb had been on that first visit, sat a new object. It was a nest. Not a real nest, there were no twigs or grasses or the other materials a bird might use. It was constructed entirely from toys. Rag dolls had been unspooled, their wool stuffing pulled out and arranged in a soft, circular bed. Wooden figures had been laid on their sides to form a low wall around the stuffing. The clay marbles were embedded in the wool at regular intervals, catching the lantern light like tiny jewels. And in the very center of this construction, resting in a depression shaped precisely to its dimensions, was the pull toy lamb, placed on its side with its chipped paint face pointing upward toward the sky. Elle stood and looked at it for a very long time. Her hands were shaking, and it was not the cold. She heard the dragon before she saw it. A sound so low it was less a hearing and more a sensing, a vibration in the stone beneath her feet, a displacement of air that pressed against her eardrums from the outside in. She turned slowly, raising the lantern, and the light fell on a shape that had materialized at the edge of the quarry like a thought arriving fully formed in the mind. The dragon was not large, as dragons went. Else had seen illustrations in the old books that Draven kept in a locked cabinet in his study, illustrations drawn by artists who had never seen a dragon but had taken the descriptions of terrified survivors and inflated them with the currency of imagination. Those dragons were vast, mountainous, their wingspans wide enough to blot out the sun. This dragon was perhaps the size of a large horse, with a body that was lean and angular in a way that suggested not grace so much as economy. Every line of it pared down to its essential function, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. Its scales were the color of wet slate, dark enough to disappear against the quarry walls, and its eyes were a pale, luminous amber that caught the lantern light and returned it with an intensity that made Elsa's breath stutter in her chest. It was watching her. Its head was lowered, not in aggression but in something that looked unsettlingly like uncertainty, and its claws were curled against the stone in a way that made them seem almost delicate, almost careful, as though it was aware of how easily it could break the ground beneath it and was choosing not to. Else did not run, she did not scream. She did not reach for the herbs in her pocket or the small belt knife she had brought more out of habit than any belief in its utility. She stood still and held the lantern up and looked at the dragon, and the dragon looked at her, and for a long moment the quarry held nothing but the sound of water and breathing, hers rapid and shallow, the dragon's slow and deep, each exhale a warm current that stirred the air between them. "Hello," Elle said. The dragon's amber eyes narrowed, not in anger. In something closer to perplexity, the expression of a creature encountering a stimulus it had not anticipated and was not sure how to process. Else took a breath. Her hands were shaking badly now, the lantern swaying in her grip, and she was aware, acutely, painfully aware of how small she was, how thin and how old and how fragile, standing in the dark in front of a creature that could kill her with a single, casual motion. She was aware of her own mortality, in a way she had not been since the night her husband had died. Since she had sat beside his bed and watched the light leave his eyes and understood with a clarity that felt like a physical blow that she was going to spend the rest of her life without him. That understanding had not killed her. It had done something worse. It had made her brave because once you have survived the thing you thought you could not survive, everything after it feels like borrowed time, and borrowed time does not inspire caution. It inspires a reckless, aching tenderness toward the world, a desire to touch everything fragile and broken and precious before the borrowing runs out. She took a step forward. The dragon went still. Not the relaxed stillness of a creature at ease, but the locked, frozen stillness of a prey animal that has been caught in the open and is calculating whether flight or fight offers better odds. Its wings shifted against its back, a subtle rustle of membrane that sent a small cascade of pebbles skittering down the quarry wall behind it. Elle stopped walking. She crouched down instead slowly, her knees protesting, and set the lantern on the ground between them. The light pooled outward in a warm, unsteady circle, illuminating the stone and the toys and the edge of the nest and the dragon's claws, which she could now see were not the brutal, hooking weapons of the illustrations, but something more precise, long and tapering, with a fineness at the tips that spoke of dexterity rather than destruction. These were hands. Clever, careful hands, scaled and clawed, but hands nonetheless. Hands that had built the nest with its ring of wooden figures and its bed of wool stuffing and its precise arrangement of clay marbles. Hands that had stolen toys from children's windowsills and cradles and bedroom floors, lifting them with a gentleness that left no mark, carrying them through the night sky to this place. "May I?" Else asked, gesturing toward the nest. The dragon did not move. Its eyes tracked her hand, then returned to her face, and there was something in that gaze that Else recognized because she had seen it in mirrors, in the eyes of patience, in the faces of people standing at gravesides. It was the look of someone who has been alone with a secret for so long that the secret has become a kind of gravity, pulling everything inward, and who has forgotten perhaps that there was ever a time before the weight of it. Else moved forward on her knees, which was undignified and painful, and which she did not care about even slightly. She reached the nest and looked down at it, and the shaking in her hands became a trembling that spread through her entire body because she was right. She had known she was right from the moment she saw the arrangement of the toys, but knowing and confirming are different things. And confirming this particular knowing was like pressing her hand to a wound that she had suspected existed but had not, until now, been able to locate. The nest was not a nest, it was a cradle. Was shaped like a cradle, sized like a cradle, constructed with the specific obsessive attention to softness and warmth and security that a parent brings to the place where their child will sleep. The wool stuffing was layered in careful graduated depths, thicker at the bottom, thinner at the edges, creating a gentle basin that would hold a small body in place without constraining it. The wooden figures forming the wall were placed with their flat sides inward, creating a smooth surface that nothing could catch on. The clay marbles were not decorative. They were weights, holding the wool in place, preventing it from shifting if something moved inside the cradle. Something small, something that would fit in a space the size of a human infant. Else looked up at the dragon. The dragon was watching her with an intensity that was almost unbearable, its amber eyes fixed on her face as though it was reading something there, some message, some judgment, some verdict that it both feared and desperately needed to hear. "You had a child," Else whispered. The sound that the dragon made was not a roar or a hiss or any of the sounds that the stories associated with its kind. It was a low, keening vibration that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside its chest, a sound that bypassed the ears entirely and went straight to the bones, and Else recognized it the way she recognized all sounds of grief, not because she had heard it before but because it was the universal frequency of loss, the note that every grieving creature in the world, human or otherwise, eventually found and held and could not let go of. The dragon lowered its head, not to attack, to hide. It turned its face away from the lantern light and pressed its jaw against the stone, and its body curled inward, and the keening sound became something quieter and more terrible, a sound like a sob that had been compressed and compressed and compressed until it could fit inside a chest as large as this one, and even then it barely fit, and the edges of it leaked out through the scales and the joints and the places where the armor of the body could not quite contain the immensity of what it was trying to hold. Else did not touch the dragon. She knew from long, hard experience that there are moments when touch is the wrong language, when the grieving needs space more than comfort, when the presence of another body is an intrusion rather than a solace. So she sat back on her heels and she waited, and the lantern burned low, and the water in the quarry caught the last of the moonlight and turned it into something that looked, for a moment, like silver. She waited a long time. When the dragon finally lifted its head, its eyes were dry. Dragons do not cry, not the way humans do. Their grief finds other channels, but something in them had changed. The guardedness was still there, the wariness of a creature that had been hurt in ways it could not articulate and had responded by retreating into the deepest, most defensible part of itself. But there was something else now, too, a crack, a fissure. A hairline fracture in the wall that had been built around the pane, letting the smallest sliver of light through. The dragon moved, Slowly, with the exaggerated caution of something that has learned that its own strength is a weapon it cannot always control, it reached toward the nest. One long, tapering claw extended and touched the pull-toy lamb, stroking along the painted side with a precision that belied everything else had ever been told about the clumsiness of draconic kind. The touch was gentle. Gentle in the way that a parent's touch is gentle, in the way that comes not from restraint, but from a love so fundamental that it has become indistinguishable from instinct. The dragon lifted the lamb and held it close to its chest, tucking it beneath the jut of its jaw, and the keening sound came again, softer this time, a murmur rather than a vibration, and Else understood. The dragon was holding the lamb the way it had held its child. Else returned to the quarry every night for 7 nights. On the first night she simply sat. She brought the lantern and the blanket and a thermos of hot tea that she did not drink, and she sat on the stone shelf with her back against the quarry wall and she waited. The dragon came after midnight, as it always did, and it landed at the far edge of the quarry, and it watched her from a distance with those amber eyes, and neither of them approached the other. They simply coexisted in the dark, two small flames of consciousness in a large and indifferent space. And when dawn began to gray the eastern sky, the dragon left without a sound, and Else climbed out of the quarry with her unused tea and her shaking hands, and went home to sleep for 3 hours before her rounds. On the second night she sat closer to the nest, not touching it, not near enough to be perceived as a threat to it, but closer. The dragon came later this time, well past 2 in the morning, and it circled the quarry twice before landing, and when it did land, it placed itself between Else and the nest in a way that was clearly protective but not clearly aggressive. It did not bare its teeth, it did not spread its wings. It simply stood there, a scaled wall between Else and the cradle, and Else understood that this was negotiation, that the dragon was allowing her presence but setting a boundary. And she respected the boundary because boundaries are sacred things, and she had never yet found a good reason to violate one that had been clearly communicated. On the third night she brought something with her. It was a doll, not a child's doll, but one she had made herself from spare cloth and dried lavender and a few stitches of thread. It was crude, objectively speaking, the kind of object that a child would glance at and discard in favor of something more interesting. But it was soft, and it smelled of something living, and Else had made it with the specific intention of giving it away. And she set it on the ground halfway between herself and the nest, and then retreated to her usual spot against the wall. The dragon approached the doll the way a stray cat approaches an offered hand, slowly, with frequent stops, with the body angled for flight, with every muscle tensed for the possibility of betrayal. It sniffed the doll for a long time, its nostrils flaring, and then it picked it up with the same careful claw tips it had used on the lamb, and it carried it to the nest, and it placed it inside in the wool depression beside the lamb. Then it looked at Else. And Else, who had held the hands of the dying and witnessed the first breaths of the newborn and sat with the grieving through the long, black hours when it seemed like the sun would never come back, felt her eyes fill with tears for the first time in years, because she understood now what the dragon was doing, and the understanding was more than she could carry without breaking. It was building the cradle for a child that was gone. Not decorating, not hoarding, not collecting trophies or practicing thievery or engaging in any of the behaviors that the villagers had attributed to it. It was building a cradle. It was making a place that was soft and warm and safe, a place where a small body could rest, a place that smelled of life and warmth and love, and it was filling it with the only things it could find that carried the scent and the shape and the texture of the thing it had lost. Toys, objects that children touched and held and loved. Objects that carried in their wood and cloth and paint the faint but unmistakable residue of small human hands. The dragon could smell it, Else was certain of that. Dragons had senses that humans could not imagine, senses that could parse the chemical signatures of emotion and memory from the surfaces of objects. And when the dragon lifted a rag doll from a child's bed, it was not taking a toy. It was taking a ghost. It was taking the small, fatting echo of a child's love, and it was carrying that echo home to the cradle, to the place where its own child should have been. And it was never enough. It could never be enough. Because the echo was not the thing itself, and no amount of accumulated ghosts could fill the space where a living, breathing, warm-bodied child had been. So the dragon kept taking more, kept searching, kept flying over the village night after night, not out of malice or greed, but out of a hope so desperate and so raw that it transcended every boundary of species and language and reason. The hope that maybe this time, maybe this toy, maybe this one would carry enough of the living warmth to make the cradle feel like something other than an empty monument. But it never did. And the dragon kept trying anyway, because that is what love does when it has lost the thing it loves. It keeps trying. It keeps reaching into the dark and grasping at echoes and arranging them in circles and building cradles and holding lambs beneath its jaw, and it does not stop, not ever, because stopping would mean accepting the finality of the loss, and accepting the finality of the loss is a kind of death that love cannot survive. Else knew this. She knew it in her bones, in the place where her own grief had settled and vibrated endlessly for 18 years. On the fourth night, the dragon let her sit within arm's reach of the nest. On the fifth night, it let her touch the edge of the wooden wall, running her fingers along the smooth, inward-facing sides of the carved figures. On the sixth night, it made a sound that was not the keening but something different, lower, softer, almost conversational, and it extended one claw toward her, not to touch her but to show her something. On the pad of the claw, held with impossible delicacy, was a single scale. It was small, perhaps 2 inches across, and it was not the dark slate gray of the dragon's body but a lighter color, almost silver, with a faint iridescence that caught the lantern light and scattered it into a rainbow of tiny, flickering colors. A hatchling scale, the scale of a very young dragon, from the soft, vulnerable layer that they shed in their first few weeks of life. Else looked at the scale, she looked at the dragon. The dragon pressed the scale into the wool of the nest, tucking it beside the pull-to lamb and the lavender doll, and then it withdrew its claw and folded its hands against its chest and looked at her with those amber eyes, and the grief in them was so vast and so old and so deep that Else felt it like a physical weight, like a pressure against her sternum, like the entire ocean trying to fit inside her ribcage. "One child?" she asked softly. The dragon closed its eyes, then opened them, then closed them again, and this time when it opened them, it held up one claw. "One." "How?" Else asked, and she knew even as she asked that the question was too large for language, that the answer existed in a dimension that words could not reach. But the dragon tried. It reached toward the nest, and with those precise, careful claws, it rearranged the objects not randomly but deliberately, creating a small tableau, the lamb on its side, the lavender doll beside it touching, the wooden soldiers forming a crescent around them facing outward, the rag dolls laid at the opening of the crescent, their button eyes pointing toward the quarry wall. A family, the dragon was showing her a family. The crescent of soldiers was protection, a wall of guardians around the vulnerable center. The rag dolls at the opening were watchfulness, a second line of defense. And at the center, together, touching, were the lamb and the doll, two small, soft things huddled close the way siblings huddle, the way hatchlings huddle in a nest, pressing against each other for warmth. Not one child, two. Two hatchlings, small and soft and iridescent-scaled and utterly dependent, and the dragon had been their guardian, their wall of soldiers, their watcher at the gate. Had been. Else pressed her hand over her mouth. The trembling had spread from her hands to her shoulders to her chest, and she could feel the grief rising in her like a tide, and she could not stop it, and she did not try to stop it, because this grief was not hers, but she could feel it as though it was, and to deny it would have been a betrayal of something sacred. "What happened?" she whispered. The dragon went still. Its claws withdrew from the nest and curled against the stone, and the amber eyes dimmed, not like a light being extinguished but like a fire being banked, reduced to embers, the minimum viable warmth. It did not answer. It could not answer because the answer was in a language that Else did not speak, the language of scale and claw and the vast, silent architecture of draconic memory, and some things she understood could not be translated. But it showed her. Not with the toys this time but with its body, and what it showed her was this. It curled into itself tighter and tighter until it was a compact ball of dark scales, and then it went rigid, every muscle locked, every limb frozen, and it held that position for a long, terrible moment. And then it uncurled slowly, and when it did, it moved one claw to the nest and removed the lavender doll from beside the lamb, and it set the doll outside the crescent of soldiers, alone, and then it went still again. Else stared at the tableau, the lamb inside the crescent, the doll outside, the guardians that had not been enough, the wall that had been breached, the small, soft thing that had been taken while the dragon was what? Away, asleep, distracted by something that seemed important at the time and would never be important again for the rest of its life. One hatchling survived, one was taken. And the survivor, was it the dragon itself, grown from that lost silver-scaled hatchling into this lean, angular, grieving adult, or was the dragon the parent, the guardian at the gate, the one who had built the crescent and failed to hold it? Else looked at the dragon's size, its age, the depth of grief in its eyes, and she understood that it was the parent. It was the guardian. It was the one who had been supposed to protect them and had not protected them. And the survivor, the lamb inside the crescent, had grown and flown away, as children do, as living children do, leaving behind only the empty nest and the parent who cannot stop building it, because stopping means admitting that the building is over and the children are gone and there is nothing left to protect. But the dragon was not building the nest for the survivor. Else realized this with a sudden, sharp clarity that felt like a blade sliding between her ribs. The nest was not for the living child. The nest was for the dead one, the doll outside the crescent, the one who had been taken. The dragon was building a cradle for the child it had lost, filling it with the warmth and softness and love that the child should have had. And it was doing it over and over and over again, night after night, because each morning the cradle felt empty because it was empty. and the only response the dragon's broken heart could generate was to try again, to fill it again, to make it right this time, to find the one toy, the one echo, the one ghost that would make the emptiness go away. It would never find it. Else knew this with the hard, clinical certainty of a healer who has seen too many dying patients to believe in miracles. The emptiness would not go away. The cradle would always be empty. The dragon would keep stealing toys and arranging them and holding the lamb beneath its jaw and keening in the dark. And it would do this until it died. Because that is what grief does when it is this deep and this total. It does not heal. It does not fade. It simply becomes the architecture of the creature that carries it, the foundation on which everything else is built. But, Elle sat with that but for a long time, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over difficult diagnoses, looking for the angle, the approach, the one intervention that might not cure but could at least. Could at least what? She did not know. She was not a dragon expert. She was not a scholar of draconic psychology or a whisper of scaled beasts or any of the romantic nonsense that the stories like to conjure. She was a village healer with shaking hands and a dead husband and an ache in her chest that had never fully gone away. And she was sitting in a quarry at 3 in the morning in front of a creature that could kill her without effort, and she was trying to think of a way to help it, and she had nothing. Nothing except the one thing that had ever helped her in the long and terrible months after her husband died. The one thing that anyone had ever offered her that had made the ache even slightly more bearable. Presence, not comfort, not advice, not reassurance or distraction or any of the clever tricks that well-meaning people deploy when they encounter someone else's pain and find it too uncomfortable to simply sit with. Just presence. Just another person in the room, breathing the same air, existing in the same space, saying nothing, doing nothing, being nothing more than a small, warm flame of life burning nearby to remind you that the dark was not total and the cold was not absolute, and the aloneness was, for this one moment, slightly less complete. Else had had that once. An old woman in the village where she had lived before Thornhaven, a woman named Maud who had lost 3 children to the winter fever and who had simply shown up at Elsa's door the day after the funeral and sat in her kitchen and knitted, and had continued to show up every day for 4 months, and had never once said a word about grief or healing or moving on. She had just knitted. And the click of her needles and the warmth of her body, and the simple, stubborn fact of her presence had been the only thing that made those 4 months survivable. Maud was dead now, had been for 7 years. But the lesson remained because the good lessons always remain long after the people who taught them are gone. Else could not fix this. She could not bring back the dead hatchling or fill the empty cradle or undo whatever catastrophe had shattered this dragon's world. But she could be present. She could sit in the quarry with her lantern and her shaking hands and her insufficient, inadequate, utterly human self, and she could breathe the same air as this grieving creature, and she could let it know, in whatever way communication was possible between their vastly different kinds, that it was not alone in the dark. So that is what she did. On the 7th night, Else did not go to the quarry alone. She had spent the day thinking, not about what to do, because she still did not know what to do, but about how to explain what she had learned without making it sound like the ravings of a woman who had spent too many nights sitting in a quarry talking to a dragon. She went to Dice Kell first, because Dice was Sarah's mother and Dice had been the one to push Draven into action, and Dice was, in Elsa's experience, the least sentimental and most practically compassionate person in the village, which was a combination that could be relied upon in a crisis. She told Dice everything: the nest, the cradle, the arrangement of the toys, the scale, the tableau of the family, the crescent of guardians, the lamb inside and the doll outside, the grief. The endless, relentless, incomprehensible grief of a creature that had lost a child and could not stop trying to build a world in which that child still existed. Dice listened without interrupting. When Else finished, Dice was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Sarah still asks about the lamb, every night. She says she wants to give it back to the dragon because she thinks the dragon needs it more than she does." Elsa's vision blurred. She blinked and the tears fell, and she did not wipe them away. "Can we bring her?" Else asked. Dice looked at her for a long time, and then she nodded. They went at dusk, Else and Dice and Sarah Kell, who walked between them holding her mother's hand and clutching in her other hand a small object that she had carried with her since she was old enough to carry anything, a worn wooden block, unpainted, smooth from years of being rubbed and rolled and held. It was not a toy in any meaningful sense. It was a comfort object, a thing that a child carries not because it entertains her but because it is hers, because it holds the shape of her small hands and the warmth of her body and the particular, irreplaceable signature of her presence. It was, Else realized, exactly the kind of thing the dragon had been stealing. Not toys, traces, evidence that a child existed and was alive and was warm. They climbed down into the quarry as the last light bled from the sky, and Sarah looked at the nest, larger now, more elaborate, the accumulated work of months. And she said in a voice that was very small and very steady, "That's where my lamb lives." "Yes," Elle said. "Is the lamb okay?" "Yes, love, the lamb is okay." "Does the dragon take care of it?" Else looked at Dice. Dice looked at the sky, where the first stars were appearing, and then she looked back at her daughter. And Else saw in Dice's face the same understanding that she herself had come to, the understanding that children often arrive at truths faster than adults because they have not yet learned to complicate things with reason and doubt. "Yes," Dice said, "the dragon takes very good care of it." Sarah nodded, and then she did something that neither Else nor Dice had anticipated or suggested or in any way prepared for. She walked to the nest, and she knelt beside it, and she placed her wooden block inside the depression, next to the pull toy lamb and the lavender doll and the silver scale. "For the baby that's not here," Sarah said. And then she sat back and looked at the nest with an expression of perfect, serene satisfaction. Because she was 6 years old and she had done a kind thing, and she knew, with the unshakable certainty of childhood, that kind things were always the right things to do. The dragon came 20 minutes later. It landed at the edge of the quarry and saw them, all three of them, sitting in a row against the wall, the lantern between them casting its small circle of light, and it stopped. It froze in the way it had frozen that first night, every muscle locked, every scale flat, its body a dark silhouette against the darkening sky. Its amber eyes moved from Else to Dice to Sarah, and when they reached Sarah, they stopped. The dragon's nostrils flared. It was smelling the wooden block, Else realized. It was smelling Sarah's hands on the block, Sarah's warmth in the block, Sarah's living, breathing 6-year-old human presence soaked into the grain of the wood like water into sand. And the block was in the nest. The block was in the cradle. A child had placed it there voluntarily, deliberately, with the stated intention of giving it to the baby that was not here. The dragon made a sound, not the keening, not the low conversational murmur. Something new, something that Else had never heard from it before, a high, thin, reedy note that rose and fell like a question, like an inquiry directed not at Else or Dice but at the universe itself, a sound that seemed to ask, "Why would a child give this to me? Why would a child who still has her own warmth and her own life, and her own mother's hand to hold reach into the dark, and place a piece of herself in the cradle of my dead child?" Else did not have an answer. She did not think the dragon expected one. She thought the dragon was asking the question the way all grieving creatures ask questions, not to receive an answer but to give shape to the shapelessness, to wrap arms around the immensity of the pain and hold it close, because even holding the pain is better than letting it drift untethered in the void. The dragon moved toward the nest, slowly. Each step deliberate, each claw placement precise, the way it always moved, the way it moved when it was handling something fragile. It reached the nest and looked down at the wooden block resting beside the lamb, and it lowered its head until its jaw was nearly touching the wool, and it inhaled deeply and its eyes closed, and it held that position for so long that Else began to wonder if it had fallen asleep standing up. Then it opened its eyes and turned its head and looked directly at Sarah Kell. And Sarah Kell, who was 6 years old and had not yet learned to be afraid of things that were larger and stronger and more dangerous than she was, looked directly back. "Your baby is safe," Sarah said. "I put my block there to keep it company. It's my favorite thing and it's warm from my hands and it smells like me and I think your baby would like that." The dragon's eyes did not change color or shape or size. Its face did not rearrange itself into an expression that a human could read as gratitude or sorrow or anything else. It was a dragon, and dragons do not have human faces, and the temptation to anthropomorphize is a trap that the sentimental fall into and the practical avoid. But something happened in those amber eyes. Something shifted. Something that was not an expression but was more like a weather change, a movement of internal atmosphere, a barometric adjustment in the soul of the creature. The guardedness did not disappear, it would never fully disappear because grief does not work that way, but it moved aside just slightly, just enough to let something else through. Something that looked, in the imperfect and insufficient language of human emotion, like acknowledgement. Like recognition. Like the moment when a drowning person sees a hand reaching through the water and understands, not that they will be saved, but that someone is trying. The dragon turned back to the nest. It lowered itself to the ground beside it, folding its legs beneath it, settling its body against the stone with a sigh that stirred the lantern flame and made it dance. It curled around the nest, not covering it but bracketing it, forming a crescent with its own body that mirrored the crescent of wooden soldiers inside, a living wall, a guardian's posture, the shape that a parent makes around a child when the world is dark and dangerous and full of things that might do harm. And then, for the first time in 4 months, the dragon rested. Not slept, rested, there is a difference. Sleep is the surrender of consciousness, the temporary abdication of the self. Rest is something else, a deliberate release of tension, a chosen stillness, a moment in which the body says to the world, I am not fighting right now, I am not searching right now, I am not reaching into the dark for echoes, I am here in this place with these people, and for this one moment I am going to let myself be still. Sarah leaned against her mother and yawned. Dice put her arm around her daughter and pulled her close. Elle sat with her hands in her lap, shaking, not from cold anymore but from the sheer emotional exhaustion of what she had witnessed and participated in. And she felt the tears running down her face and did not wipe them away because there was no one here who would judge her for it. And because some tears are not meant to be wiped away but simply allowed to fall, like rain, like the natural and necessary expression of a sky that has held too much for too long. They sat with the dragon while it rested. They sat with it through the middle hours of the night, when the world is at its darkest and quietest, and most indifferent to the small dramas of the creatures that inhabit it. They sat with it while the stars wheeled slowly overhead and the water in the quarry lay still and black, and the cold pressed against them from every direction. They sat with it because it needed them to sit with it, and because they were human, and humans, for all their flaws and fears and failures, possess a capacity for sustained, purposeless presence in the face of another's suffering that may be, when all is said and done, the single most remarkable thing about their species. They are not the strongest, they are not the fastest, they do not have scales or claws or wings or the ability to breathe fire. They are small and soft and breakable and brief, and they die so easily and so often and so predictably that their entire existence can seem like an exercise in futility. But they sit with the grieving. They sit in the dark, in the cold, in the quarry, in the presence of a creature that could destroy them without effort, and they do not run, and they do not fight, and they do not try to fix what cannot be fixed. They simply sit. They simply stay. They simply let the grieving know in the only language that matters that the dark is not total and the cold is not absolute and the aloneness is, for this one moment, not quite complete. The dragon rested until the first gray light of dawn crept over the rim of the quarry. Then it lifted its head and uncurled its body and stood, and it looked at the three humans huddled against the wall, and it made one last sound, the reedy, questioning note from before, but softer now, gentler, with something in it that might have been gratitude or might have been grief, or might have been something for which no word in any language, human or draconic, had ever been coined. Then it spread its wings and launched itself upward, rising in a spiral out of the quarry, and it flew east toward the Thornwood, and it did not take any toys with it. The dragon did not come back to Thornhaven for 6 weeks. The village noticed. Of course the village noticed. A thing that happens every night for 4 months and then abruptly stops is, by definition, noticeable. The guard rotations were relaxed, then abandoned. The toy chests were unlocked, then left open. Sarah Kell got her lamb back, else retrieved it from the quarry on the morning after that 7th night, and when she brought it to the Kell household, Sarah held it to her face and breathed in its scent and said, "It smells like the dragon," and smiled, and that was that. But Else kept going to the quarry. Every 3rd night, regular as a tide, she climbed down with her lantern and her blanket and her thermos of tea, and she sat against the wall and she waited. Sometimes the dragon came, sometimes it didn't. When it came, it did not approach her. It landed at the far edge of the quarry and watched her from a distance with its amber eyes, and sometimes it made the reedy questioning sound and sometimes it was silent. And after an hour or two it would leave, flying east into the Thornwood, and Else would climb out of the quarry and go home. She did not tell anyone about these visits, not because she was ashamed of them, but because they were not the kind of thing that could be explained to someone who was not there. And because the thing that was happening between her and the dragon, if thing was even the right word for it, which it probably wasn't, existed in a space beyond language. A space where two grieving creatures acknowledged each other's grief without trying to manage or mitigate or resolve it, and that acknowledgement was in itself enough. On the 6th week, the dragon came to the village. Not at night, not in the dark, silent, stealthy way it had come for 4 months. It came at midday in full sunlight, flying over the rooftops in a slow, deliberate arc that made every person in Thornhaven stop what they were doing and look up. It was enormous in the daylight, not in size. It was still only horse-sized, but in presence, in the sheer undeniable reality of it, the way a thing becomes more real when seen clearly rather than glimpsed in shadow. Its scales caught the sun and scattered it, and for a moment it looked less like a creature and more like a piece of the sky that had broken off and learned to move on its own. It landed in the village square. In the middle of the square, on the flat stone where the market stalls were set up on trading days, in full view of every window and doorway and gap between buildings. It folded its wings against its back and stood still, and it waited. People came, slowly, cautiously, in ones and twos and then in clusters, emerging from their homes like animals emerging from burrows after a storm. They stood at the edges of the square, gripping doorframes and each other's arms, and they stared at the dragon, and the dragon stared back at them, and for a long-held moment nothing happened. Then Sarah Kell walked out of her mother's house and into the square. She was holding the pull-to lamb in one hand and the wooden block in the other, and she walked with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who has not yet learned that the world is supposed to frighten her. And she crossed the square to where the dragon stood, and she stopped in front of it and looked up at its face, which was 8 feet above her head and could have swallowed her in a single motion, and she said, "I brought these back for you, but you have to promise to take care of them." The dragon lowered its head, slowly, carefully, the way it always moved around fragile things. It brought its jaw down to the level of Sarah's face, and its amber eyes, vast, luminous, ancient, looked into her eyes, and something passed between them that no one watching could name or describe or even fully perceive, but which every single person in the square felt in their chest like a change in atmospheric pressure, a shift in the weather of the soul. Then the dragon opened its jaw just slightly, just enough, and it exhaled. Not fire, not smoke. Warmth. A slow, gentle breath of warmth that ruffled Sarah's hair and stirred the dust at her feet and carried in it a scent that was not unpleasant, but was not quite like anything any of them had smelled before: stone and wood smoke and something floral, something that might have been lavender, and underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the clean, bright, ineffable smell of a living child. Sarah smiled. She set the lamb and the block on the ground in front of the dragon's clawed feet, and she stepped back, and the dragon looked down at the objects and then back up at Sarah and then at the crowd of villagers watching from the edges of the square, and its gaze moved from face to face to face, reading them the way it read the toys, not their surfaces but their depths, not what they showed but what they carried. Else was standing at the edge of the crowd, and when the dragon's eyes reached her, she felt the weight of that gaze like a hand pressing against her sternum, and she understood that the dragon was not looking at her. It was looking through her, at the thing she carried, the ache in her chest that vibrated endlessly, and it recognized it, because it carried the same ache in a different shape, and the recognition was not comforting, but it was something. Something that was not comfort and not healing and not resolution, but was perhaps the thing that comes before all of those, the raw material from which comfort and healing and resolution might one day impossibly be built. Acknowledgement, witness, the simple, devastating knowledge that someone else knows. The dragon picked up the lamb and the block with its careful claws. It held them against its chest, beneath its jaw, the way it had held them in the quarry. It looked at Sarah one more time. Then it spread its wings and rose into the air, straight up, a column of dark scales and scattered light, and it turned east toward the thornwood and it flew away. It did not come back. Not to the village, not to the quarry, not to any of the surrounding settlements. The toys stopped disappearing. The night watches were disbanded. Life in Thornhaven returned to its normal rhythms of work and weather, and the small, unremarkable struggles that comprised the vast majority of human existence. And the dragon became a story, a tale that was told and retold and gradually reshaped by the process of retelling, until it fit more comfortably inside the boundaries of what people expected stories to be. But Else knew the true shape of it. She kept it in the place where she kept all the things that mattered too much to be spoken aloud: the memory of her husband's last breath, the sound of Maud's knitting needles in a quiet kitchen, the way the dragon's eyes had looked when Sarah placed the wooden block in the nest and said, "For the baby that's not here." She knew that the dragon was still out there, somewhere in the vast and unknowable wild of the Thornwood, and she knew that it was still grieving, because grief like that does not end, it cannot end, not for a dragon, not for a human, not for any creature that has ever loved something enough to be destroyed by losing it. She knew that the cradle in the quarry would slowly be reclaimed by water and weather and time, and that the toys would rot and the wool would mold and the silver scale would sink into the mud and disappear, and that eventually there would be no physical evidence that any of it had ever happened. But she also knew, and this was the thing she carried with her for the rest of her life, the thing that she took out and held up to the light on the nights when the ache in her chest was particularly bad and the darkness felt particularly total, that for one night in a collapsed limestone quarry at the edge of a forgettable village in the northern reaches of an indifferent kingdom, a human child had placed a wooden block in a dragon's cradle and had said, "This is for you, this is for the one you lost. This is a piece of my warmth for your emptiness," and the dragon had rested. It had rested. In 4 months of relentless, obsessive, grief-driven activity, it had not rested once. It had stolen and arranged and built and rebuilt and flown and searched and gathered, night after night after night, without pause, without respite, driven by an engine of loss that admitted no interruption. But on the night that a child gave it the one thing it could not steal, a freely offered piece of love, placed by a living hand into the cradle of the dead, it had stopped. It had curled around the nest and it had rested, not because the grief was gone, but because the grief had been, for one moment, witnessed. And being witnessed is not the same as being healed, but it is the thing that makes healing possible. The seed from which the slow and uncertain and deeply imperfect process of recovery might, given time and grace and more kindness than the world usually provides, eventually grow. Else Barrowman died at the age of 71 in her bed, with the window open and the sound of the wind in the thornwood and the smell of dried lavender on the pillow beside her. The ache in her chest was still there, vibrating softly as it had vibrated for 35 years. It had never stopped. She had never expected it to stop. But it had become bearable, not because time healed all wounds, time does not heal all wounds, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something, but because she had learned to live inside it the way one learns to live inside a house with a drafty room. You seal the gaps as best you can, you keep the fire lit, you accept that some cold will always get in, and you fill the space with warmth and light and presence until the draft becomes not a source of suffering but a feature of the architecture. A reminder that the house is real, and you are in it, and the wind outside, for all its power, cannot touch the things you have built within these walls. On the night after she was buried, the villagers of Thornhaven reported seeing a dark shape in the sky, flying low over the cemetery, circling once, twice, 3 times, before turning east toward the Thornwood and disappearing into the dark. It did not take anything. It was just there. And then it was gone. And that is the story of the dragon that stole toys and never played with them. It is not a story about heroism or conquest or the triumph of human ingenuity over monstrous nature. It is a story about grief, which is the one enemy that no sword can defeat and no wall can keep out and no amount of courage can outlast. It is a story about the things that grieving creatures do when they cannot find another way to carry the weight. The cradles they build, the echoes they chase, the toys they steal in the desperate, beautiful, heartbreaking hope that the warmth of a child's hands might somehow, impossibly, reach across the void and touch the place where their child used to be. And it is a story about the thing that humans do better than any other species in the known universe: not fight, not build, not conquer, but sit in the dark, sit in the cold, sit in the presence of suffering so vast and so deep that it makes your own pain look small, and sit there anyway, not because you can fix it, but because you can witness it, and witnessing is not nothing. Witnessing is the foundation of everything. Witnessing is the wooden block in the cradle, the freely offered piece of warmth, the small, stubborn flame that says to the darkness, I am here, I see you, you are not alone. It is not enough, but it is what we have. And sometimes, for reasons that no philosopher or scientist or theologian has ever been able to adequately explain, it is exactly enough. It is enough.